Pursuant to the resolution of the House of the 19th of March 2024, we will now proceed with the moving of a condolence motion for Mr Brian Langton, former member for Kogarah.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I move that this House extends its deepest sympathies to the friends and family of Mr Brian Joseph Langton, who passed away on 17 October 2023. Acknowledges Mr Langton's years of service, including as the member for Kogarah from 1983 to 1999, and Minister for Transport and Tourism and Minister for Fair Trading and Emergency Services. Recognises his significant contribution to the state of New South Wales over many, many decades. Mr Speaker, Brian was a man of lifelong public service. As the Minister for Transport in the Carr government, as the member for Kogarah for 16 years, and as the Mayor of Kogarah before that. To those of us who knew him, Brian was a generous friend, a mentor, a volunteer in the community, a man of energy and a man of action. And through it all, a warm and loving family man. The Parliament offers its deepest condolences to his friends and his family who are here with us in the gallery today. And that's particularly so to Elizabeth and Brian's 3 daughters, Davina, Adele and Celia. Mr Speaker, it was said at Brian's funeral that he was one of those rare people for whom contributing to his community was as natural as breathing. Rare as it might be, that mentality of service was always there from Brian's youngest days. After leaving school, he joined the St Vincent de Paul Society, and before long he was serving as the president of their jail visitation program. And that meant that every weekend, Brian would get into his car and instead of going to the beach or the movies, he'd drive to one of the state's prisons. And for those of you who know where the prisons are, they're often in regional communities in far-flung corners of the state. Brian offered company to the lonely, he listened to inmates, he helped family members survive on the outside. Later, he would make these extraordinary visits with Elizabeth, his future wife, which seems like a bit of a crummy first date if I'm going to be honest with you. I know Brian adored Elizabeth and they enjoyed a long, supportive and happy marriage for almost 50 years. Mr Speaker, Brian at the end of the day believed in social justice, and that conviction carried him into politics, where he ran for Kogarah Council as a 23-year-old. At the time, the sitting member for Kogarah was a man named Bill Crabtree. He held the seat for almost 3 decades. And Bill was a smart man, smart enough to know that Brian was a real threat. So much so that he decided to appoint his wife as the chair of the Kogarah Electoral Credentials Committee. That's right, Jeff, Alice, she's a neighbour of mine.
Smart.
What followed was a series of strange bureaucratic coincidences in the finest traditions of the Labor Party. Applications were lost in the mail. Signatures were struck down on arcane technicalities, all with the result of blocking Brian's membership to our great party for a long time. But luckily, Brian Langton was a determined man, and after 3 years, he eventually achieved the membership of the local branch and it was approved. Very soon after that, he was pre-selected as the member candidate for Kogarah. He was then elected to Parliament on the 22nd of October 1983, which was an auspicious day for the Labor Party because 4 by-elections were held on that day. Elected on the 22nd were Brian, Richard Amery, who's here with us in the gallery today, Andrew Refshaugi and Bob Carr. All 4 became ministers in a future Labor government and all 4 made a lasting legacy on the state of New South Wales. Mr Speaker, Brian brought many gifts to public life. He had a quick and versatile mind, he had a way with words, he had a knowledge of the business world, and it was all backed up by immense energy and an enormous work ethic. And to rise to those positions, particularly through opposition, you need to work hard. It made him an extremely effective member of this Parliament. In opposition, Brian campaigned on behalf of rail workers who'd been laid off by the Greiner government. In a newspaper column at the time, coalition ministers anonymously nominated the one member of the opposition front bench they would poach for their own team? And the answer was Brian Langton. After Labor's victory in 95, Brian joined the cabinet as the Minister for Transport and Tourism. And I know he was very, very proud of the work that he accomplished in this place, particularly in expanding access for people with disabilities to the state's public transport system. He was instrumental in growing our fleet of wheelchair-accessible buses in the state. And he took enormous satisfaction, quite justifiably so, in correspondence he received on these reforms. One was from a man named Kevin Byrne. Kevin lost the use of his legs as a teenager, and he contacted his local member to say, Brian, I just got public transport to work for the first time in my life. And he was 16 years old. He went on to say, it was you who did it. Accessible buses, accessible bus stops, accessible railway stations here at Kogarah. Friends, at the end of the day, that's what public life's all about. Getting a letter from an individual like Kevin and knowing that you made a difference in this parliament and in your community. As Brian said in his last speech in this parliament from this lectern, he was in politics to represent the poor, the sick, the needy, the downtrodden, and those who, for whatever reason, are unable to fend for themselves, while embracing those who can contribute. Brian was one of those contributors in our community over many decades in both a public and a private capacity. He fought for a new cardiac ward at St George Hospital. That unit continues to save lives today. He volunteered at the St George School, at the St George AFL Club, at Calvary Hospital, at the St George Cancer Centre. He gave his time to Lifeline and the Wayside Chapel. When I was pre-selected to run for Kogarah, I was acutely aware of the kind of footsteps that I'd be walking in. People who joined, who'd been selected as MPs or ministers, and then became pillars of our community. I also came to learn over time that many of them were still around and active in Labor Party politics. And I have been very lucky to learn, and so have many of the people that I've come through politics with, like Ryan and Joe and many, many others. But we've been lucky enough to learn from the support and advice over that journey from people like Brian Langton and Richard Amory and Brian's daughter Davina and Brian's successor Cherie Burton as the member for Kogarah. Brian was a character. He was fantastic company. He was fun to be around, and he was extremely funny. Once Bob Carr, a famously healthy man, for those that don't know, devoted to his steel-cut oats, told his transport minister that a sensible man should be having some fruit for breakfast. Brian replied that he did. He just knocked off a cherry ripe. He was irreverent, but it was underscored by an essential good nature. He was passionate, he cared about other people. He'll be missed to the Labor Party and to this state, and he was a massive loss as a beloved father and grandfather.
I thank the Premier. I call the member for Oatley to second the motion.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I second the condolence motion today. Mr Speaker, I'm honoured to rise on behalf of the opposition to pay tribute to the former member for Kogarah, Brian Joseph Langton. Mr Speaker, the St George area, as we know, is a tight-knit community, and anyone who has had the honour of representing our area in local, state or federal politics knows this. And my first interaction with Brian was a young chap when I joined the Young Liberals back in 1994, and during the 1995 state election, after school each afternoon, I would volunteer for the Liberal candidate for Kogarah, Margaret Domkins, who I understand actually joined the Labor Party at a later stage. There's still time for me, I'm told. Clearly demonstrating Brian's persuasive abilities, can I tell you. Maybe I should take a leaf out of his book and maybe join up some of my Labor opponents to the Liberal Party. It was during this formative period of my teenage years that I first witnessed Brian's dedication and passion to public service and the community he cherished so dearly. Mr Speaker, Brian's long career in politics spanned many aspects of our political system. Brian was first elected as an alderman to Kogarah Council, and later Mayor, and serving in that role from 1979 to 1980. He later went on, as we heard before by the Premier, to represent the good people of Kogarah in this place from 1983 to 1999, marking the start of what was to become an extraordinary 16-year political career. As we know, Brian became Minister when Labor came to power in 1995, serving at various times as Minister for Transport. In fact, he took the train to Parliament, Minister for Tourism, Fair Trading and Emergency Services. And from his early days as a young alderman on Kogarah Council to his tenure in this place, Brian's passion for public service never wavered. He approached every role, every enormous responsibility with compassion, with gusto and an unwavering dedication to the people he represented. And beyond his political career, Brian's dedication to community service knew no bounds. He continued to give back to the community long after leaving office, volunteering his time and talents to organisations like the Wayside Chapel, to Lifeline, to Meals on Wheels and St Vincent de Paul. His selfless devotion to helping those in need was a true reflection of his compassionate spirit and generous heart. He was also a champion of the St George Cancer Care Centre at St George Hospital, assisting many, many times in fundraising and support for those in need. Brian never failed to stand for those in their time of need, always ensuring that he had the backs of those who needed his help most. In addition to his contribution to the community, Brian also was deeply involved in the world of sport, particularly AFL. And for 2 decades he served on the New South Wales AFL judiciary and was a proud president of the mighty St George AFC AFL club. Members of that club still talk highly of his wonderful contributions that he made at the St George AFC AFL. His love for the game was matched only by his passion for his community, and his presence will be sorely missed by all who knew him. Mr Speaker, Brian's journey was truly one of service and dedication, marked by a steadfast commitment to making a difference in the lives of others. And even in his last years, I personally continued to witness this dedication and talented spirit, as every month I would sit next to him at our local council traffic committee, where Brian was the Premier's local representative on that committee and would demonstrate his local knowledge by strongly pointing out, can I tell you, why council's plans weren't going to work, and send them back to the drawing board and keep them on their toes. It was a wonderful partnership between myself and him on the local traffic committee for just over 12 months. I would approve anything he wanted, and of course he would approve anything I would want. It was a great combination. Throughout his more than 28 years of public service, Brian was a fierce advocate for his constituencies and for his constituents, fighting tirelessly to champion their interests and concerns, whether it was lobbying the former Premier Neville Wran to fund the cardiac unit at St George Hospital, which is still running today, and can I tell you, is still talked about. His campaign to save that cardiac unit at St George Hospital was only raised recently by Professor Horton, who assisted in that campaign. All alongside Phil Bates, initiating the annual cycle promotion at Carlton. Brian's dedication to the St George area never wavered. His legacy of public service will endure for generations to come, and a testament to his unwavering commitment to the betterment of our community. Speaker, on behalf of the opposition and myself, I want to extend my deepest condolences to Brian's beloved wife of 47 years, Elizabeth, his daughters, and the entire Langton family. May he rest in peace, and may his life of dedication, passion, commitment be remembered for many more years to come. I will miss Brian at the local traffic committee. Thank you.
I thank the member for Oatley and call the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Speaker. I rise to also express my condolences to the family of the late Brian Langton, the former member for Kogarah, former Minister for Transport, and to, of course, offer those condolences to his wife, Elizabeth, his daughters Davina, Adele and Celia, and his 7 grandchildren. Brian was a man who brought good cheer to this place over many years, not a tribute that can be paid to many, I fear. I know that, and we've heard in this chamber this afternoon, that he was held in very high regard by the Premier, and of course by the other former member for Kogarah, well known to many of us here, Cherie Burton, and was known to many members of this place, past and present, and made lasting friendships across the aisle. This was reflected in enormous attendance at his funeral. Many a former minister and Premier in attendance of broad political persuasions. As we've heard, he was larger than life. Those who served with him remember a man who was generous to others and always thoughtful to those who sought his advice and assistance in this place. During late parliamentary sittings, I was talking to some people today in preparation for this. I've discovered that he was well known for entertaining colleagues in the caucus room playing his guitar and singing hits from the 60s. I can't imagine that happening now. Country and Western apparently rated highly, but he had quite a repertoire. To the delight of many, his voice and his booming laughter would echo around the Parliament. He was always generous with his advice to young and inexperienced backbenchers, and I know how meaningful that would have been to so many new MPs. I'm told that his quick wit was never really personal. He was king of the interjection, but always used to disarm and usually elicited a smile from many an opposition member. His service to the people of Kogarah, as the Premier has gone into, was exemplary, serving in that role for over 15 years. That is some contribution. I'm sure others will also recall that he had a long and a positive involvement, as we've heard, in public transport as Shadow Minister and then Minister. He was instrumental in a campaign, and this may seem familiar to others in this place, to remove tolls from roads across New South Wales. In particular, the M5 cashback scheme, been in the news recently, which was particularly important to the people of Kogarah, was championed and achieved by Brian Langton. He initiated the purchase of wheelchair-assisted buses and ensured that many a transport project included local manufacturing. Some things stay the same. After he left Parliament, as we've heard, he served as an independent board member of Bus New South Wales from 2005 to 2012, and also in the role of chair. The Private Bus Industry Association in New South Wales was not always a friend of the government. As always, Brian opened up his avenues of communication that achieved better outcomes for the people of this state and the bus industry. He was masterful in bringing different parties together. In 2008, the then New South Wales Transport Minister John Watkins appointed Brian Langton to the position of Chair of Sydney Ferries, a position I'm told he relished, constantly riding ferries and getting to know the staff. Whilst in that role, patronage grew, safety improved, reliability and customer satisfaction increased, operating costs reduced, and staff voted in favour of a groundbreaking single maritime agreement. Importantly, these improvements led the then Premier Christina Keneally to reject an independent inquiry recommending the privatisation of Sydney Ferries. The then Minister boasts even now that Brian undertook that role with enthusiasm and enormous intelligence. His extensive involvement in his local community was just an extension of his gregarious nature, as was his involvement in politics and the great Labor family. He offered support and advice to many an up-and-comer in his local community, served as the president of the St George AFL, was involved in St George Hospital and volunteers at the St George School, a beautiful school for specific purposes in the Kogarah area, a school for students with intellectual, physical and multiple disabilities. It's a big contribution to make. A personality as big as Brian's is hard to imagine gone. His beliefs, and mine as well, assure me that Brian continues to look out for his beautiful family, and hopefully the memories of this incredible man will be ever remembered in the intelligence, thoughtfulness and legacy of public service that now rests with his 3 daughters and their beautiful grandchildren. My deepest condolences to Elizabeth and the entire family. Vale, Brian Langton.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. I call the member for Tweed.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak about Brian Langton, the Honourable Brian Langton. And first off, I'd like to say to Elizabeth and the family, my wholehearted condolences. I met Brian a number of years ago. To set the scene a little, I was a manager down at the Georges River Sailing Club. Okay, started there about 76, and had the pleasure to know Billy Crabtree, or the Honourable Billy Crabtree, and his wife Alice. And I was unaware until the Premier was saying the issues that were occurring behind the scenes. But Brian used to appear at the Georges River Sailing Club on a regular basis, and we had a lot of rapport with one another. And I always remember Brian as a bit of a larrikin. That smile, that quick wit would break me up. And then I sort of lost track of Brian after I left there and went out to Revesby Workers. And up in Tweed Heads, where I ended up the chairman of the local tourism board. And lo and behold, my good friend Brian Langton was the tourism minister. So he came up several times, but there was one particular time he came up there for the North Coast Regional Tourism Awards. And I was a bit in awe that somebody I knew was a minister of the Crown. That was pretty, because I was only fairly young in those days. And we were there waiting for the awards and the announcements. And unfortunately, Brian and I probably had a bad habit back in those days. And he came sliding up to me. He said, "Where can we go for a smoke somewhere?" I said, "Oh, Minister, I just had one out near the fire escape around the back where no one can see us." He said, "Good, we'll go there." And right at that moment, somebody from Tourism New South Wales, back in those days, came up and said, "Minister, you need to start the awards right away." He said, "Madam, leave me alone. I am talking to somebody of importance. We shall be ready when we're ready." And as we walked out, he said, "Do you like that?" I said, "Yeah, Minister, that's pretty cool." Yeah, I like that. So, but I should tell you a little funny story with Brian. One of the times as a duty manager at Revesby, lo and behold, we had a fundraiser evening for the local Labor Party, and there was lots of prizes, and we did everything right. And then Brian and a few people came over to me and said, "Mr Provost, you should buy some tickets." And back in those days, probably not too many remember it here, we didn't have ATMs. You know, there was nowhere to get money. And I said, "Brian, I've only got a few dollars," you know, because back in those days, a middy was 33 cents and a schooner was 45, so you didn't need a great deal. So I had to run into the safe and write an IOU for $25, which was, you know, a fair whack. And I bought these tickets, and lo and behold, I won a $2,000 painting, which is still hanging in my house today.
Wow.
So thank you, Brian. I really appreciate it. And in later years, I used to run into him around the corridors here, and we talk about the old times. And the other thing too with Brian, my father was a deputy principal there at Carlton South Public School, which is just across the road from St George Leagues Club and things like that. So I have a real bond, but he always showed me a great deal of respect. And in many regards, even though we didn't have a great deal of time together, he was sort of like an older brother to me. And he kept saying to me, "You should join the Labor Party. You should, you know, you'll be good at this. You'd be good at this." And we used to laugh about it when he used to come in here, and I see him at the previous members' functions and that. So, Elizabeth and your family, I think you've experienced an enormous joy by knowing him. I know today's a sad event, but we look back and reflect. But we also need to look at the joy that he brought us when we actually knew him. And the short time I knew him, he brought me a great deal of joy, great deal of laughter. I wish I had his wit though. But on behalf of myself and even my electorate, thank you, Brian Langton, and condolences to you and your family. Thank you.
Thank the member for Tweed. I call the member for Heffron.
Mr Acting Speaker, on behalf of the Parliament of New South Wales, I rise to acknowledge the life and service of the Honourable Brian Langton, who passed away in October of last year. I extend my heartfelt sympathies to Brian's wife Elizabeth his 3 children and 7 grandchildren during what I'm sure is a very difficult time. For more than 27 years, Brian diligently and fiercely represented the Kogarah community. He served as a staunch advocate for the people of Kogarah at both the local and state government level. Born in Maroubra, his family moved to Carlton when Brian was 5. He was educated at Maris Brothers, the same school as our now Premier. He was a lifelong resident of the area, steadfast in improving the lives of his constituents. Brian joined the Labor Party at the age of 15, and during his time in this place, Brian was a devoted Labor member and an important figure in the Carr government. Like me and many other members of this place, Brian's political career had its origins in local government. Following in the footsteps of his father Joseph, Brian was elected as an alderman of the former Kogarah Municipal Council in 1973 at the age of 23. He served on council for 12 years, including 1 term as mayor, until he left council in 1983 to run for state parliament. His involvement in local government also extended to membership of the Local Government Association Executive from 1981 to 1982. Serving in local government, I believe, provides a strong foundation for anybody entering this place. As the closest tier of government to the people of this state, being on council enriches your perspective with a deep insight about the issues at the heart of the community. And whilst on council, Brian worked tirelessly to address these issues and enhance the lives of those within the local community of Kogarah. His tenacity carried into this place when he was elected as a member for Kogarah in 1983 at a by-election, and this marked the start of what would be a 15-year parliamentary career. In the early days, Brian served as chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Road Safety. He was a member of several caucus subcommittees, including Corrective Services, Police and Emergency Services, Public Works, Ports and Roads, Sport and Recreation, Tourism, Finance, Employment, Planning and Environment. Whilst Labor was in opposition, Brian served as Shadow Minister for Transport for 6 years. When Labor came to government in 1995, he was appointed Minister for Transport and Tourism. Reflecting on his time leading the transport portfolio, Brian was particularly proud of the increase in patronage on public transport and putting the issue of accessible public transport on the nation's agenda. He worked hard to ensure members of the community with a disability were not excluded from public transport, campaigning for accessible buses, bus stops and train stations. He recounted conversations with constituents telling him that they're able to catch public transport for the first time since they were a child because of the accessibility improvements that had been made under his watch. Brian later also served as Minister for Fair Trading and Minister for Emergency Services. He was a fierce champion of Labor values and always stood up to fight for people who could not stand up for themselves. In his final speech to this House, he reflected on this, and I quote, "Being a Labor member was and is knowing that the party is the only one capable of representing the poor, the sick, the needy, the downtrodden, and those who are, for whatever reason, unable to fend for themselves, and embracing those that can contribute." Beyond the political arena, Brian was well known for being an active volunteer and a philanthropist in the local community. He selflessly dedicated his life, both while in this place and when he left Parliament, to give back over the years. He just volunteered to local organisations including the Wesley Mission, Wayside Chapel, Lifeline, St Vincent de Paul and Meals on Wheels. He also contributed to the board of St George Hospital, St George School for Children with Disabilities and the St George Cancer Care Centre. Brian was renowned for his love of aerial ping pong, or Aussie rules as some call it, and his passionate involvement with Kogarah's AFL community. He served as president of St George AFL and was an important part of the AFL Sydney Tribunal for more than 15 years, many of these years as chair. Brian played a pivotal role in setting up the inaugural AFL New South Wales ACT Tribunal and was chair from its inception in 2020 until he stepped down in 2023. Shortly before his passing, Brian was given an AFL Sydney Life membership, which made him one of less than 60 people to hold that honour. There are a couple of stories I do want to tell the House that reflected Brian and a couple of interactions that I had with Brian. The latter one had a profound effect on me. The first was on election night 1987. Brian and Elizabeth and Christine and I went to the Rockdale Mayoral Charity Ball. And there we were in our dinner suits, participating in those mayoral charity balls that used to be quite frequently held in our constituencies. And word went out that the member for Barton, Gary Punch, was having almost an apoplectic reaction as the votes were being tallied and reported in by scrutineers. So Brian and I decided that we better go to the Barton electorate office to see how we could help those people who were trying to manage Gary Punch. It was Gary's third election, which means that it was essential for Gary to be re-elected because you needed to win 3 times to get a pension. Secondly, in those days, Barton was very much a marginal seat. It was a bellwether seat. And Gary Punch had only held that seat by sheer determination and hard work. And as the votes were being tallied, as Brian and I in our dinner suits went to the door of the electorate office, having left our wives at Rockdale Town Hall, we could hear the then member for Barton screaming in the high-pitched voice only those who knew Gary would regularly hear. So as we went into his office and phone calls were coming in from scrutineers, I decided the best way to do with Gary was to lock him out of his office. And Brian and I locked ourselves into a room, and I was taking the calls from the scrutineers and writing them down. And Brian had a pencil, one of those lead pencils in his ear, and he was scribbling on a piece of paper, licking the end of the pencil and working out the 2-party preferred vote in his head. I mean, I just sort of, and he sat there just calmly doing it as if somehow or other everybody could perform this task. And it wasn't until the very last booth came in and within about 20 seconds that Brian worked out the 2-party preferred vote and proclaimed Gary to be the winner. And that was probably at least an hour and a half or 2 hours before anybody else knew or television knew. I just found that to be the most remarkable mathematical calculation that this really quietly spoken, respectful individual had that skill. Probably the most profound effect that Brian Langton had on me was something that I have never forgotten, and it's something that has stayed with me from the time I had this conversation with Brian. Brian was the Minister for Transport in the Carr government, and he lost that ministry under the most incredibly unfair circumstances. Yeah. And I went and spoke to Brian, and I said to him, mate, I'm really sorry. I mean, you're a great Minister for Transport. You've been treated so unfairly. It was not long after it happened. And he looked at me and he said, Ronnie, I've got everything I've got in life because I've got 3 letters after my name. He said, those letters are ALP. If it wasn't for the ALP, I never would have been the Mayor of Kogarah. If it wasn't for the ALP, I never would have been the member for Kogarah. If it wasn't for the ALP, I never would have been a shadow minister. And if it wasn't for the ALP, I never would have been a minister. So I very much valued those letters that I've had after my name and feel that I was incredibly privileged for the opportunity that those 3 letters gave me. To this day, I remember that conversation because many of us, either members of this House who have moved through this House or been in the political process, have all generally felt defeat, all generally felt that they needed some other position that somebody else got, all feel that they've been dudded by their colleagues or by their leaders or by their party machines along the way, and felt that they had some sense of entitlement. But Brian Langton had no sense of entitlement. He just had a sense of appreciation and respect for the very party he joined at 15 and the opportunities he gave. And to me, that says everything about that man as a human being, everything about that man and his his commitment, both to the public and to the party of which he served. And I value the opportunity of being able to say that in this House because it might remind all of us in this House the privilege that we have and the privileges that have been extended to us because of the membership of the political party that we represent in the New South Wales Parliament. Brian will be remembered for his unwavering commitment to public office and for the lasting impact he left on the Kogarah community. He made it his life's mission to stand up for those less fortunate, to ensure that their voices were always heard. And while in this place, he raised the concerns of his constituents and dealt with the big issues of the day impacting the people of New South Wales. I know, and I've given an example of the great source of wisdom and guidance many of us have had within the Labor Party over the years. I know that his presence here and across his Kogarah community will be deeply missed by all. Once again, I extend my deepest sympathy to Brian's family and loved ones. May he rest in peace.
Call the member for Maitland.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak on the condolence motion for Brian Joseph Langton, who passed on the 17th of October 2023, and I pay my condolences to his wife Elizabeth and daughters Davina, Adele, and Celia, and other members of the family and colleagues and friends, some of whom are here today. I knew Brian mainly from the bus industry, in fact, from his years in Bus New South Wales, which coincided with the main years of my involvement with that organisation as a country tour organiser and operator. To me, as someone from a country town, Brian was a wise, immaculately dressed, urbane, sophisticated, and most importantly, approachable and trusted advisor to the industry. In fact, I can't remember him ever not having a smiling face. He had a ready, kind word, a quick repartee, or a funny anecdote about how things should really work in whatever sort of issues the government of the day was putting on the industry. And as a politician, he knew the value of those anecdotal stories of success where a small change to a person's life would really unlock opportunity or a sense of hope for them, independence. And sometimes that would be unlocked for the first time. And those are the stories that are most illustrative of the power of government and the power of politics. He took that view into the bus industry, and while he never tried to impose his views or necessarily lead the discussion, he used his vital role in the industry to sort of guide them towards the sense of truth and wisdom in the end, making a better industry. I actually asked Matt Threckle, the Executive Director of Bus New South Wales, to share some comments for you, because I think it's so important, and the industry just holds him in such respect, as he would have known when they're at the funeral. But he gave me these comments and I'll just read them. Brian Langton's service as an independent member for the Bus New South Wales Board of Management from 2005 to 2012 significantly impacted the bus and coach industry in New South Wales. Brian shared his experience as a Minister for Transport and Tourism and helped shape policies aimed at growing and improving public transport services. His advice and insight helped Bus New South Wales and its membership to manage significant change following the Unsworth Review and reforms to bus service contracts and safety regulation. Brian's legacy reminds Bus New South Wales of the importance of collaboration between industry and government while focusing on the benefits for customers and community. As the current Minister for Regional Transport and Roads and seeing the current safety challenges across all modes of transport, I know that Brian's sage advice in those industry meetings and conversations with little operators like me and big multinationals certainly led and was what the government needed for a safer and more customer-focused industry, and it was certainly welcomed by us and led the time amongst the different transport modes at the time. In my view, it drove a stronger and more significant response from the bus industry to the many safety challenges that always face the industry, and it was ahead of its time. And it was interesting to hear Deputy Premier Prue Carr talking about the same kind of contribution and impact in the ferries industry. Brian, to my mind, was a man who could bring everybody to the table and just carry us all forward, looking like he was the jester, but really just actually getting things done in such a quiet, friendly, supportive way. It's a testament to Matt's comments about the importance of that deep collaboration between industry and government and the need for robust and honest conversations about the challenges that face us in public transport, and that really did come from Brian. I mean, I was a Labor member in plain clothes in my time in the bus industry. You know, Brian never outed me, but it's not an easy industry to get trust from, if I can say. But once you do, you're in part of that family forever, which is very valuable. With a nod to Brian's wisdom of how to do things right, I did read his valedictory speech a couple of days ago because, of course, who better to frame the achievements of his political life than him? And in that vein, though, I do want to put on, again on the record what he saw as his raison d'etre to be in the Labor Party. And part of this has been quoted, but I think the whole part is important. It's not just a matter of being in the Labor Party, it was about believing in social justice and the intrinsic link between the industrial and political wings of the party. That link is the foundation of the Labor Party, and it must never be permitted to weaken. It's the heart and soul and meaning of our existence as a party. How right. Being a Labor member was and is knowing that the party is the only one capable of representing the poor, the sick, the needy, the downtrodden, and those who are, for whatever reason, unable to fend for themselves, and embracing those who contribute. And it really is that long contribution of the Catholic boys that came up through the Labor Party that had that commitment to social justice taught at the knees of the Marist brothers. I think all of this holds still so true today. It's certainly what's driven me as a member of this party for over 30 years. Brian's service as an alderman, a mayor, his 16-year parliamentary career, his service as a minister, all of these things speak to this deep, deep-seated commitment to social justice, but not just the political career. Outside of politics, the member of the New South Wales AFL judiciary, sport that unlocks so much in terms of opportunity for those who aren't academic, president of the St George AFL, volunteering at the Wayside Chapel, the jails, Lifeline, Meals on Wheel and St Vincent de Paul. An investment banker and travel manager before coming to this place, he truly understood the transformative power of this place to effect social justice for people and the practical impact it has on people's lives. In his valedictory speech, he noted the Labor mission was at the core of good government, saying that gets down to the rationale of government. Governments have been in existence for centuries and for a very good reason. Only governments can provide the 4 basic services that people need: schools, hospitals, police and decent transport. They are basic social services which cannot be dictated solely by a profit motive. They must always be provided as cost effectively as possible, but in the end they are social services. Everyone in this chamber knows that that's the same mission I bring to my portfolio: social determinant of education, health, opportunity and jobs, social inclusion. In this vein, Brian was rightly proud of his enormous contribution to public transport as the minister, particularly the emphasis that was put on public transport and the significant increase in patronage in his term as minister, the right services to get people where they need to go. I want to recognise, though, particularly his role in putting accessible public transport on the national agenda for the first time. The Disability Discrimination Act in the Commonwealth was first passed in 1997, and it led to an enormous change in public transport and ensuring it's more accessible. And although there's always more to do, and we made announcements about this today, his move really changed this. That conversation that Brian started in government, on the national stage as a state minister, he continued in his role as an advisor to the bus industry, and all of us should be grateful for that. Ever a man of the people, even in his last speech, he read with some joy a letter from Shirley Williams, who wrote to him thanking him for the joy that he had given to her intellectually disabled daughter, who was 45 and had been confined to a wheelchair. Shirley had written, "Usually I don't write to Polly's, but I had to tell you how much happiness you've given us with the wheelchair buses. I've enclosed a cutting from the leader which will tell you our story. No matter what happens to you in the future, please just remember how much happiness you gave one beautiful, special girl." Brian articulated his values and action to achieve social justice. That's the hard bit, right to the end of his 30-year political career and beyond. Ever the wise counsel, Brian also used his time to provide parting advice to us as MPs. Our purpose here, as part of the democratic process, is to raise individual concerns on behalf of our constituents, just like Shirley, as well as deal with the big issues that affect the whole state. We grapple with those issues, and it's not always easy. It's not made any easier when we're sidetracked by the petty and the trivial. My hope is that the great majority of members who seek to find solutions to the major problems continue to do so and have success. This is an ongoing challenge for all of us. Focusing on the things that are important for our constituents, our communities, that can unlock opportunities for the state and our nation can be difficult, but it's vital. And in these days of social media and whataboutism, it's easy to get lost in the noise of things that are not important, or focus on the things that stopped us getting to the heart of what really matters to people. And the thing that I loved about that comment from Brian was that it was hope for all of us. And it spoke to his genuine hope for success for all of us in this chamber in finding solutions to the major problems for our constituents, our communities and our states. Because good government is bigger than the petty squabbles and harping of oppositional politics. Attending Brian's funeral last year, I saw so many people from across the aisle paying tribute to a man who was here for the right reason, who didn't let that petty or trivial stop him from making a contribution. At the funeral, there was a unity across the political divide in respect for a man who sought to improve the lives of some of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged people in our state, and actually did it. Brian had a choice after leaving politics to step away from community and industry, and yet he didn't. He continued his Labor mission, his social justice mission, and he's an inspiration. I want to again pass on my deepest condolences to his family, to his friends and loved ones, and in fact his whole community, because we have lost a good one. We'll remember Brian, and we will be continued to be inspired by him and the values we all share. He lived life as he spoke it, a social justice warrior in plain clothes. Vale Brian Langton.
I thank the member for Maitland and call the member for Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is with honour and some sadness I rise. And I'd like to obviously mirror everybody who's spoken so far tonight and the social justice which previous members touched on. I met Brian back in the early 90s. At that time, I was working for Cardinal Edward Clancy. Thinking of joining the priesthood, weren't sure, but I was smart enough to join Young Labor at the time. And in that time, I met Brian, the early 90s. He was in this house that I met him. And it's interesting because as I sat here listening, I thought about how I've been involved in politics and how my political career had been linked to Brian all the way through. And it's not just me. I think of those early days and when I first talked to Brian, and it was about social justice, it was about looking after working people. It was about, the way that the then car opposition, what we could do to make things work right.
I wanted to be involved in industrial politics as in the Labor Party, but also with the trade union movement. And Brian and I had these conversations about social justice time and again. But it wasn't just me. Sure, my life with Brian, and it kind of reflects that, but I look at our friends who were around at that time, who would go and sit in his office. He'd always be very generous with a beer or a wine, and they certainly did drink a lot of beer and wine in those days compared to what we have to do now. A cigar, but predominantly cigarettes in the balconies, in the garden. It was a normal thing to do in those early 90s. But I look at it, we obviously talk about Cherie Burton, who went on to become an outstanding minister in a future government. But it wasn't just them. I look at the photos from that time, and from my memories, I mean, there was Jason Clare, Michelle Rowland, Reba Ma, and many others. And we know that Brian provided, guidance and mentorship to our current Premier, but also to all those other people and many others. And that was the thing about Brian. He was always welcoming, always happy to help, to give a joke, to have a laugh. And he was always there at a social function. He was always about when we needed him. And that really worked for me in Young Labor, and we kind of looked up to him. He had come in under the Rann government, a man who was still around and was still coming to functions Neville Rann, and we'd be in awe of him and awe of Brian. And then, of course, he went on to win when Kogarah won and go on to become Transport Minister. And at that time, my job also changed. I went from working for the Catholic Archdiocese to going and working for the AWU. So I worked up from going to Mass every day to going to workplace meetings. And I predominantly worked in rail and buses, both in the maintenance in Chullora, in the different depots, in those workshops. And also then I was given the task of doing civil construction in those areas as well, so building the railway system. So I got to see Brian, not only in Young Labor, but by 25, 26, I was seeing him as the minister. And at that time, I was not as eloquent as I am now. The F word was said nearly every sentence. I was obviously at the union office in Granville. I lived in Parramatta. I'd grown up in central Queensland. So Brian was far more sophisticated. I mentioned one of the other members said that. He dressed immaculately, he spoke well, and he knew how to articulate things far better than I did. But he was always open for that discussion. And you can imagine in union politics, especially the AWU, which was going through all kinds of amalgamations, civil construction generally is always rough and tumble. To be in the middle of a dispute, to be able to go in and give him a ring and say, can I just come and have a talk to you, to get some guidance, he would talk to me off the record, not a problem. Because it was about solving problems and helping working people. It was ingrained in who he was. And that was one of his great strengths. And he did that throughout his life. Now, of course, he went on to tourism and fair trading as Minister of Emergency Services. And throughout that time, he was great. He really, really was. And then I remember when he decided to resign, and I remember we were at a social function when I found out about it. It was a Labor Party function, and we were devastated. And we know all the crap that was going on at the time, I'll use that word, and not one of us shirked the fact that Brian was a great man and didn't need to go. We didn't want him to go. We said it to him time and again. Now, sadly he did, and we understood why, right? And then when Cherie decided that she would step up, and Brian helped, and she went on to win that seat. And she was told there was no way that you were going to win that seat, and she did. And she's still around helping us in the Parliament today, just like Brian does, or did, rather, over these years. So, it was interesting because now that Brian's gone, and I went to the funeral, as you know, it was last year now, I was very, very sad and very, very stunned. But I could also see in that funeral just how many people were there, from all the political divides, people I hadn't seen for years, that Brian had touched their lives in so many ways. The other thing, apart from politics, Brian and social justice and I talked about was AFL. And we talked bits and pieces, but I wasn't much of an AFL person when I was in Young Labor or the union. But then I came back and was elected as a member for Prospect. And in Prospect, in the Gibbs Field, we had the only full-time AFL ground. And so he pulled me aside and said, how are the Parramatta Holroyd Goannas going? Right? And I went, oh my God, someone else knows who the Goannas is, right? And he did. Knew all about it, knew the site, knew it, and we had long chats. And every time I'd run into him in the corridors here, he'd raise that question again and talk about the Goannas, how they were going. I think more than a year ago now, we talked about how they had now women's teams and they were winning the pennants. I mean, it's good. And it's his influence on AFL in New South Wales has made it a better sport. A sport I now really enjoy. And I can understand why Brian enjoyed it so much. He went on and improved not only after he left Parliament, as we've already spoken about, going and working, in the Wayside Chapel, Lifeline, Meals on Wheels, Vinnie's, and St. Paul, and countless other local events. Incredible. Continued on, because that's who he was. And that's what he helped make us. So, Elizabeth, I know what a wonderful, great man he was. And you know even better than I do. And, I look at Davina and Adele and Celia, and I look how proud you must be of your father. And I hope that my daughters can be as proud of me one day as you are of him. So thank you for helping us be part of your life with him. Thank you for helping make the man he is and was today. And, God bless you all. And he will always be in my mind, as I know it will be with many of us here. So I thank the House.
I thank the member for Prospect and call the member for Canterbury.
Speaker. I rise to remember Brian Joseph Langton. I'd like to acknowledge my friend, his daughter Davina, her mum, Adele and Celia's mum, Elizabeth, and Brian's wife, the wonderful family, friends, colleagues, the grandkids, and I can see a number of Brian's colleagues in the gallery as well. Richard Amery, Alan Ashton. When I entered politics, and particularly I was 20 when I joined the Labor Party. My parents had moved from Canterbury and we'd moved to Hurstville. And Brian was a big figure in that local community. When I entered politics in public life, Brian was already well into a lifelong dedication to the Labor Party and public service. Many colleagues in this place have been mentored by him, and as the Premier talked about his own experience, and many have succeeded because of his guidance and his belief in our democratic institutions, the belief in our nation, the belief in our state, the belief in our people, the belief in multiculturalism. Brian's entry into party political life was a done deal. Born into a Catholic family, he once told this place that his father dragged each of the kids by the ear along to the local ALP branch to sign them up. So it was for Brian at age 15 in 1963 when his father duly committed him to the Labor fold. This era, though, it was a low point for the ALP. Within 2 years, Liberals would rule both this state and the nation, and Australia joined the Vietnam War, causing ructions within the Labor Party. Brian once said that during this period he lost the faith, leaving the party not for long before eventually coming back. He entered politics at a young age, but a mature young man, and with that community spirit, a raconteur from a very early age. And he won a seat on Kogarah Council at just 23. By the end of the 70s, he'd risen to become mayor. After serving 12 years on the local council, he then entered the New South Wales Parliament in 1983 during a by-election. He faithfully served as a government MP and then in opposition, that hard, long slog in opposition, 7 years in opposition. I've done 12 years in opposition, and I understand for the MPs, that the Labor MPs during that time, and particularly Brian holding a shadow portfolio such as transport and working and slogging it out day in, day out, and a testament to him and to his colleagues and to that cohort of Labor MPs for winning the election in 1995 when Bob Carr became the Premier. Brian Langton was asked by the Premier to serve as Minister for Transport, Tourism, Fair Trading and Emergency Services. But his he did an exceptional job, as my colleagues have stated, and I've spoken to a number of colleagues of his, not those in the gallery, not those present, but others who said he was a fine transport minister who made valuable changes to transport in this state, who cared about the workers, the railway workers, bus drivers, the ferry workers, and cared about access to the public. And he was someone that really cared, but somebody, as described by my colleagues, that brought people together, and that was one fine quality of being Minister for Transport. Brian retired in 1999, but his commitment to Labor was lifelong. And when I had my many interactions with Brian as the Secretary of the Kingsgrove branch of the Labor Party, it was some interesting interesting mechanics in terms of the branches in that part of Sydney. But after a number of attempts, losing a couple of times, putting my name forward to become the Secretary of the Kingsgrove branch of the Labor Party, after about 3 times we eventually got there, and I won't be factional, but it was I was very, very proud because we won the branch off the left, which was great, and we went on to of course outreach and be collegiate with all our branch members, but making sure that having people like Brian who helped us and helped navigate the party for the young people, but young people from a multicultural background. I didn't have your normal pathway, coming through the party where my parents were involved. My parents worked in factories, my dad was a painter. The Labor Party provided the opportunities for young migrants like my parents to have work health and safety, to have work rights at work. But the daughter of migrants being involved in politics was quite unusual at the time. And so having the elders, not that old, but having the elders like Brian and people of that time, and particularly our members at the time of Catholic background, Catholic faith, who wanted to ensure, they were the trustees of the party. They opened the door and they reached out, and he was a man of honour. He was a man of honour. In Greek, there's a word called philotimo. You can't translate that. It has many meanings, but it is, if you do a direct transliteration, philo, of friend, and timi is honour, philotimo. He had philotimo, and he was a good man, a gracious man, and he always, particularly with me, he'd come to the Kingsgrove branch and provide us a report from the Parliament. And for young people at the time, like myself, it was just amazing hearing from the local member of Parliament. And mind you, the Kingsgrove branch had a number of MPs. We were a combined branch at the time, so we had the member of Canterbury at the time, Kevin Moss. We had George Thompson, the member for Rockdale. We had the member for Kogarah, Brian Langton. And it was amazing to have those three come along and provide a branch report and talk about the wonderful things that the Labor government did and what the Labor government was delivering for the people, and particularly for the people of St George and Canterbury. And for us, it was just incredible. You'd see them on TV and you'd see them, out there, and Brian was a minister. He was a minister who would report to our branch. So it was just a wonderful one. He's a wonderful man. Reached out and always there to provide advice and guidance. Colleagues considered Brian a self-deprecating team player who was no nonsense but had a sense of humour. And as I said, I found him a gentleman, a true stayer of the party, and a trustee of the Labor Party. A trustee meaning that handing down the baton, not giving away the baton, but handing down the baton and the guidance, and making sure that as trustees of the Labor Party, and being one of the world's oldest political parties, we have a responsibility to the next generation to do better, to advance, to build a better society, a better democratic society. Locally, Brian Langton said about making important critical change. And as a local councillor, you can see the changes that he made in the local community, whether it's at the parks or whether it's the local traffic committee. But those things were important. And one thing that Brian and his cohort of colleagues taught me and taught my other colleagues who are here today and others was that every little thing matters. If it's fixing the local, if it's fixing the local road, if it's somebody coming to you seeking support, you have a duty and an obligation to help them. And every single person needs a response, whether you like it or you don't. Always answer your phone. These were the tidbits. These were the really important things that Brian taught me and others. I'll give you a little story that Brian, being a very involved local member, knew all his community groups, knew all the different ethnic groups, knew all, as we all know, he advocated very strongly for services at St George Hospital, and he knew everyone, and everyone knew him. Now, he established a very, very good relationship with the Greek Orthodox parish and community of the Resurrection of Christ, Our Lady of Myrtles, and St Elisa of Kogarah, the Greek Orthodox Church at Kogarah. It was across the road where Brian's office was. It was just up the road, across the road, and it's one of the largest Greek Orthodox churches in New South Wales, in Australia, in fact. Brian established a very good relationship with the church, and especially with Father John Vivaris, who was much younger at the time, and he, like myself and many of us who would attend the parish at different times, were very fearful of him. He played a very, very influential role in the local community, and he was a pretty big guy in the local community. And Brian was very supportive of all the places of worship and very supportive of this church. Now, councillors, including Councillor Catras, used to have many meetings throughout throughout Brian's time as the state member with Father John. And at one of these meetings, it was a particular meeting, Brian was wearing shorts, right? So Brian was wearing shorts, and Father John, as for those of us who know him, isn't always happy, right? And I love Father John. Just to put on the record. And just to put on the record, I love Father John. But Father John was a very tough, is a very tough, strong man, very influential, and his word goes. And at this particular meeting, Father John was so happy with what Brian was doing for the church and the news that he came to deliver, that with an open palm, he slapped him on his thigh as a gesture of gratitude. But, as Councillor Catras could see, that Brian had exhibited a very excruciating, painful smile. And as they left the meeting, Brian said to the councillors, "Remind me not to wear shorts next time we have a meeting with Father John if we are going to give him some good news for his parish." So this is just one story, but what an amazing human being. And For Brian Langton, in his own words, it was not just a matter of being in the Labor Party, it was about believing in social justice and in the intrinsic link between the industrial and political wings of the party. And for him and many of us, he said, the link is the foundation of the Labor Party, and it must never be permitted to weaken. It is the heart and soul and meaning of our existence as a party. Brian's commitment to social justice and public service is the key to the man he was. In his final years, he volunteered for various charities and causes, including the Wayside Chapel, whose CEO, John Owen, said of Brian today, "He was a committed member of the breakfast crew with his loud pink shirts. No one ever knew he was a former senior member of the government. He was simply Brian with a smile. He had a deep love for his family and would often talk about his many grandkids. When he was diagnosed with cancer last year, Brian had a no-fuss approach and effectively apologised to everyone at Wayside, saying, 'Sorry, I might not be able to make my shifts anymore.' It is sad. It is very sad. I say to the family, a very good man has left us, but he is in good hands. And he inspired many of us coming through the Labor Party in the local area. I thank him for his service to our state, to our nation, to your family. Thank you, Vale Brian Langton."
I thank the member. I call the member for Heathcote.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to acknowledge the Honourable Brian Langton MP, member for Kogarah, and pay my respects to his family and friends today. I joined the Australian Labor Party at the age of 21 and was very much involved in Young Labor. Brian was one of the many that I looked up to, one of the many MPs I looked up to, and who very much inspired me. I then went on to work for the former member of Kogarah, Cherie Burton, where I came across Brian quite often and was lucky enough to work with him again. Brian was born the 21st of January 1948 and his place of birth was Maroubra. The former mayor, long-serving state Labor member for Kogarah and in the Carr government, Minister Brian Langton, passed away at the age of 75. Educated at the Maris Brothers Kogarah, Brian began his political career when he was elected to Kogarah Council in 1971 at the age of 23. He served on the council for 12 years and as mayor in 1979 and 1980. Brian was elected to the New South Wales Legislative Assembly in 1983 and retired in March 1999. After serving as Shadow Transport Minister, Brian was appointed Minister for Transport and Tourism when Labor came to government in 1995. He performed those roles until December 1997, when he was appointed Minister for Fair Trading and Emergency Services. In April 1998, Brian resigned from Cabinet and did not seek re-election for Kogarah. In 2008, he was appointed Chairman of Sydney Ferries Corporation. To prepare for this speech, I reached out to former Premier and member for Lakemba, the Honourable Maurice Yemmer, and the former member of Kogarah, Cherie Burton, who gave me some beautiful insights on Brian. Maurice advised that Brian was someone who took politics seriously but never lost sight of the light-heartedness of life. Whether friend or foe, he was famous for his quips. It was never personal. He made things light-hearted, whether on the floor of Parliament or in caucus. When there was robust debate on a bill or proposal, Brian would always add humour to de-escalate. Maurice advises that Brian loved telling and sharing stories and would interject at the most tense of times to brighten the place up. He was a travelling minstrel with his guitar. His office was a place of hospitality, always open for a drink, music and a chat. Shadow Minister for Transport and then Minister, Brian was an instigator for the cashbacks for tolls for the M4 and M5 and that election commitment is what helped win the election. He was an avid Swan supporter and big AFL supporter. He was always a massive supporter for St George Hospital, for funding for the hospital, resources, and for rebuilds. He caught the train everywhere and always spruiked public transport all the time and put it to public use, even though he had a ministerial driver. I believe Brian was the first minister who rolled out the Made Them Here new train carriages for the Kogarah trains. Brian was a strong advocate for local procurement, particularly in rural areas. Brian reached out across political divides that we've heard about today, and he had his own diet of cigarettes, chocolate bars, and Coca-Cola. Morris reminded me that Brian was genuinely loved in the electorate and loved by all. Former member of Kogarah, Cherie Burton MP, who's here with us today in the chamber, said that Brian was a mentor to her. When she was first elected, she said she was overwhelmed, and Brian said to her, "Don't worry, in 6 months' time, you'll have it down pat." He was always there for her for advice and for support. She called him the father of Kogarah. The member for Heffron before referred to Brian's tally room expertise and his skills, particularly on election nights. Cherie reminds me that Brian ran the tally room with his pencil for all of Cherie and Chris Minns' elections and could do it faster and tell them if they had won before any computer system. She says he loved representing her and Chris at functions and on the local traffic committee. And Brian loved regaling stories of when the traffic committee were not listening to him and his issues. The community needed fixed. He would thump his fist on the table and read them the riot act. Suffice to say, he would always get the right outcome. Brian especially loved representing Chris at functions, and at the last state election, on one particular night, he attended a Chinese function in Hurstville, where it was reported he gave a rousing speech and was up dancing with everyone until late into the evening. The next day, the electorate office got a call requesting Brian represent Chris at their next function. After politics, Brian continued to dedicate his life to volunteering and community advocacy, including combining his two great loves of Kogarah and footy. Brian was a member of the New South Wales AFL Judiciary for 20 years and served as the president of St George AFL. He volunteered at the Wayside Chapel, for Lifeline, for Meals on Wheels, for St Vincent de Paul, and at countless local events. Brian is survived by his wife Elizabeth, daughters Davina, Adele, and Celia, and 7 beautiful grandchildren. To Brian's loved ones, my thoughts are with you. I pass on my deepest condolences. Thank you, Brian, for your public service and your dedication to the Australian Labor Party. Rest in peace, mate.
I thank the member. We are considering the condolence motion for the Honourable Brian Langton, member for Kogarah. I call the member for Lismore.
Thank you, Mr Acting Speaker. Brian Langton was a character, and everybody's hearing that today. He was larger than life. He was funny. He was strategically smart, politically very smart. He was engaging, and above all, he was a true servant of the people, of the community. People will recall Brian as the Mayor of Kogarah and the member of Kogarah and many other things. And, and both posts of which he was very proud, but he knew he was in privileged posts. And Kogarah certainly has had its share of grandees, as I call them, and none more so now than our Premier, Chris Minns. And I know that Brian would have immensely liked that. And Brian, as Minister for, firstly, Transport, Tourism, Fair Trading and Emergency Services, there were portfolios in which I got to work with Brian. But even before that, before Premier Carr was Premier in opposition, and I was very fortunate to campaign with Brian, and at various times in regional New South Wales and in my area. And the one thing about Brian was he was at home in the country as he was in the city. I can't say that for all you know, everybody who serves in Parliament. I'm watching my words here. But and he could fit in absolutely everywhere. And it wasn't like we never thought, oh, you know, here comes a city slicker to the country, you know, telling us what to do or anything like that. It was always a joy to have him. I can remember driving around with him around the Northern Rivers at different times, campaigning, always in an absolute haze of smoke. And at the time, I can remember that well. And also being on the back of a big truck with him in Kyogle, the Summerland Way Committee, you know, that Jeff would know this too, they'd campaigned for absolute years and years and years for the Summerland Way, and I managed to get a commitment. It amazed everybody. I had a commitment with Brian and also with Bob Carr that I got $50 million for the Summerland Way if they were elected to government. And we did get the $50 million, and the Summerland Way was duly upgraded, and they came in under budget. I think everyone was proud. I think Scully had taken over by the time we got it finished, and it was about 48.8 million at the time, but I think everybody was amazed. But Brian had driven the Summerland Way with me and knew what it meant to people, and you know, that was the one thing I got. So you know, that always sticks in my mind, because people often say there's not that many that drive on it, why would you do it? Well, there's a whole lot of reasons why you would do it. And Brian, of course, loved his family and always talked of them very fondly. And I can remember he did so sometimes, and I say this to Elizabeth, Davina, Adele and Celia, but particularly to Elizabeth, he was often amazed that he'd done so well. So he would have that sort of convey that impression, you know, like, lucky me, you know, how did this happen to me? I can remember these things. And, you know, I didn't get to know Brian in the way that my colleagues have talked about him, because they all lived together and worked together in the city, but he was just one of those colleagues that who struck a chord with us in the country and in the party, and he was always absolutely welcome. I'll also like to acknowledge here Richard Amery, Alan Ashton, George Thompson and Cherie Burton, who has been here with us as well. And I can remember Brian, you know, he worked, he loved the Labor Party, but the Labor Party for him was the vehicle to achieve good, achieve well for community and to further social justice. He was a very adept advocate, and I can remember that as Minister he never lost the fact that he focused on his electorate, on people, and was a fierce advocate. And I really respected him for that. Also, and in that sense, he was a model of an MP, because, you know, and being a minister, he used it well, and, you know, he wasn't, as some of us say, he wasn't up himself. So that's probably the best way I can say it, how Brian was. And I'd forgotten his guitar playing until today. I can remember it well now. And it was, you know, really delight to have him here when he would sing and, you know, play the guitar. But I feel really privileged to have known Brian, campaign with him, serve with him, and he did try and get me once to the right, and I said no.
You've made one mistake.
So that's why I said to Sophie, it's all right, you can be factional, it's okay when we're here today. And but Brian always wanted to, you know, make the community a better place. And I just want to say this too. There was one time in Brian's public life where, in my view, he was judged unfairly, and Brian was an honest man. And I'll finish up, you know, with this quote, and it's from Luke, and it's "Speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and the needy," and that's what Brian did. And you know, God rest his soul. Thank you.
I thank the member for Lismore. I call the Minister for Transport to speak.
Thank you, Speaker. It's with some sadness, but also a great sense of privilege that I contribute to this debate to commemorate the life and the work of Brian Langton. Brian served as the member for Kogarah from 1983 to 1999 and as Minister for Transport from 1995 to 1997. And prior to entering Parliament, he served as an alderman on Kogarah Council from 1971 to 1983. Pretty good term. And of course, that was following his father before him. He served as mayor from 79 to 1980. But of course, we all know that his most important role was to be a loving husband to Elizabeth, and a doting father to his daughters, to Tavina, to Adele and to Celia, to their partners, support to their partners, and to their beautiful children, his grandchildren. Prior to the state election in March last year, Brian and I spoke many times about public transport. He very generously offered his time to share his insights and his advice. Sometimes these conversations were actually over Zoom because COVID was happening and he was zooming in from his study. I recall one time I was actually stuck in the front bedroom for several weeks after the COVID outbreak here. So I was a bit grumpy, but I've got to say my time on Zoom with Brian was lively, it was informative. He was a great storyteller, I've got to say, and he really took you down the journey. But there was always a purpose, and he wanted to tell me about how important he felt transport was to a good Labor government and how important the role of a good transport minister was to a good Labor government. And I've thought about that regularly in this incredibly privileged role that I hold. I believe the best portfolio, of course, in government, and I'm sure Brian thought the same. I really loved his confidence, and he was regularly trying to, I think, instill a bit of that in me, his confidence about how we were going to win the 2023 election and how we were going to do great things as a long-term Labor government. He really loved public transport. He loved the impact it would have, that its reliability was more about the impact on the public and what it meant for people's lives, that it was a key determinant for social equality, for opportunity, for access. And as the Premier noted, of course, one of his great passions was expanding access for public transport for people with disability, for everybody. And I think of the conversations that I will continue to have strongly with the Treasurer about the need to continue to invest to make our train stations accessible, to make all of our points of access available to everybody, not only because, again, it's a great way to ensure that our community is engaged, that our system is working for everybody, but also as a fundamental change, a fundamental opportunity for each and every one of those people that access provides. And we've heard some great stories about what he did as minister for so many people and what I know our government will continue to do. He believed that public transport should be a means to overcome barriers, not to create new ones. He spoke with me about access to economic opportunity, that if you missed your bus or your train, if it didn't turn up on time, that wasn't just an inconvenience. It could mean a missed shift, a missed interview, and that had real life implications for people. The job that we have to make that system run is much more than just on-time running. And I think that how transport was about connection as well, about people seeing friends and family, what you could do in this role as Minister for Transport is about much more than just numbers, maintenance and infrastructure. He understood in so many ways that transport was at the very centre of a life well lived. Brian was clearly a brilliant public servant, and his commitment to public duty extended far beyond his time in Parliament, and other speakers here today have talked about the various contributions, the missions that he was on, both locally in his community, the board of St George Hospital, but across many volunteer roles: Lifeline, Wesley Mission, the Wayside Chapel, Meals on Wheels, St George Cancer Care Centre, St Vincent de Paul, St George School for Children with Disabilities, the New South Wales Prostate Cancer Institute. He was also, of course, a passionate supporter of AFL, and the member for Heffron referred to it as aerial ping pong, but he would rightly defend this great game, and I think the merging of some of his incredible experience and great attributes with his love of the game was perfectly merged in the 20 years that he served on the tribunal and the judiciary. And we spent some time talking about sport, more about cricket, but definitely about AFL as well. It is very clear, and through the contributions today in this place, that Brian loved his community. He served it with incredible dedication. He served it incredibly well. He was a great transport minister, and I am so grateful for his advice and his wisdom. We are all great beneficiaries of his life of public service, and I think right now of his family, and I know that they will share not only sadness but great pride in the contribution that he made to his community and to the state of New South Wales.
I thank the Minister. We are considering the condolence motion for the Honourable Brian Langton, member for Kogarah, and I'm calling the member for Gosford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to make a very brief contribution. I think I speak on behalf of people with disabilities across New South Wales. Your husband, your dad, your grandfather, your colleagues. I just need to thank you from the bottom of my heart on behalf of all of us whose lives you've changed. I think as a Member of Parliament you really don't know how many lives you've touched, but I just know that being included, being able to access basic facilities like everybody else who can walk is so important. So cheers to your amazing dad and his fight for social justice and the lives that he's made possible for us to be included. Thank you.
I thank the member, and I just recognise that at the moment we have a host of young people coming into the chamber, in the upper chamber. And for those young people up there, we are currently considering a motion to remember and reflect on the life of a former minister of this House and somebody who did some incredibly important work, particularly in the areas of tourism, transport, and unfortunately he passed away, so we're spending a little bit of time today remembering him. And the students are from Stuart House. The young people are from Stuart House. Excellent. All right. There being no further speakers, I'm going to ask that members carry the motion by standing, please. Thank you, members. Thank you for your beautiful remarks this afternoon, and this House's condolences are extended to the entire family and the former colleagues who have been here for this particular motion.